This is probably one of the most personal talks I've ever given. And it's kind of fun for me because it allows me to summarize some of the important encounters in my life through the lens of Theosophy. I guess my introduction is segueing into the talk, but many of you know me, some don't. And I should say that I am a third generation Theosophist with grandparents who were Dutch Theosophists. And so my roots and the early beginnings of Theosophy for me actually started in Holland, in Denver, where my parents met. So I am going to begin this slideshow and tell you about, many of the people I have met along the way, and you are some of them. I have to warn you.
Hey, Mark, before you start, just to mention that Richard Smalley will be here next week.
Yes.
And he's the editor of the Quest magazine and a big deal in TS, so in the TSA. So
that's true.
Yeah,
that's true. We've been lucky to get them to share guest speakers with us, and so definitely tune in for Richard Smalley. That should be good. Okay, I will begin here. I have to say that it probably began before I was born. There's my mother and my father, and in the center is a well-known Theosophist named Jeffrey Hudson, and he married my parents. And so you're in for something when that happens. And I managed to get to meet Jeffrey again when I was in my 20s in the Theosophical Center in Holland. He is, of course, a well-known clairvoyant who's written many books on Theosophy and his meetings with the masters. And he's especially well known for having artists make renderings of his clairvoyant visions of nature spirits, especially, and devas, and some of the formations that are created out of their energy, like with classical music or church services and things like that. So this was 1952 in Denver, Colorado, where there still is a Theosophical Lodge run by Kathy Gann. And so I did refer to the International Theosophical Center in Naarden, in east of Amsterdam. It's a beautiful, 40-acre estate, I think. And there was an old mansion. It was like someone's estate, and the TS bought it. And it has very special energies there, and beautiful plant life, and quite a few buildings and places where people can stay for theosophical programs. But my grandparents were deeply involved in this, and my grandfather was an architect and was involved in the design and building of some of the buildings there. So it's kind of passed down through the family. My uncle is an architect in Pasadena, and was involved in the Liberal Catholic Church in Ojai and designed things there. I've done work at Orcas, of course. I can't talk about Theosophy without talking about all of you and the people who've been important in Theosophy. There's a picture of William A. Penn. the mother of Linda Jo Pim. I wish I had Linda Jo's picture. She was a very important part of the Seattle Theosophical Society for a long time. And over on the right there is John and Dorothy Abendhaus, who were like second parents to me, especially with Camp Indralaya. They would often be my sponsors, you know, because I'd go up there without my parents. And if you're alone without your parents, you need an adult sponsor. And they would often do this. This is just a picture of representing the Knights of the Round Table and so on. That is a kind of a theosophical thing done to involve young people in theosophy. And so you start out very young as being pages, and then you become squires and knights and so on. And everybody got swords. We used to have meetings in the Theosophical Library and sit in a big circle. And, you know, I remember Willamay and my mom and Phyllis and people like that, and all their children who were there. And Heidi Lewalder would be playing Bach processionals. And it was quite a fun thing because many of us young people who also were involved with Camp Indralaya and lived in Seattle would go to this. And those were some of the early things we did to get us involved in the Theosophical Society. And it was quite fun, actually. Joy Mills was another important theosophist who lived in the Seattle area for a while. She taught history in West Seattle. She went on to become one of the most prominent theosophical lecturers and educators and writers of books. Her notes on the Mahatma letters are vast, and she was president of the TS in America and international vice president of the TS in Adyar, I think under John Coates. And so she was one of those people that I remember as a child and a teenager who would come to Seattle and talk to us. And even later, when she had a chance, she would come and visit. But she liked also going to the camp on Orcas Island and lecturing up there. She has since passed away. She finished her life living down at Crotona in Ojai and was quite a lecturer down there at the School of Theosophy. And so whenever you went to Ojai, you would get a chance to see her down there. It was quite nice. I was kind of fortunate as a child because our house was up on 13th Avenue East by Volunteer Park. And it was large enough to have guest rooms. And that meant that traveling, visiting theosophists would come and stay at our house. And my mother was very gracious. She was, you know, a super theosophist. And so she always made our house available for visiting lecturers. And they usually included some of the top people in the Theosophical Society, including John Coates. And he was also involved in the Liberal Catholic Church. And I was, you know, graced with having him eat meals with us and tell us stories about theosophy and his travels. He was a tall, large man, and it always amazed me how much he could eat while he visited. So he he was really the embodiment of kindness and love and graciousness and brotherhood. And he really impressed me as the kind of person you want to be in life if you can. And I think that's him accepting the ring of the international presidency from, isn't that Perkins? Somebody might know. So he visited our house more than once as a child. And he came from an important English family. You probably remember Coates and Clark thread. He was involved in that. And his wife, Betsanne, was a wealthy woman also. They donated a large estate to the Krishnamurti Foundation, which became a school in about 70 miles west of London. And my wife and I visited that once also, which was quite interesting, beautiful place. Another early visitor to the TS in Seattle was Sri Ram. And I saw him speak in Wheaton once when I was like 8 years old. And anybody who's gone through our library will notice there's books by Sri Ram on different things. So he is definitely an important Theosophist in the early days. And another person, she didn't stay at our house, nor did Sri Ram, but Rukmini Arundale was a prominent Theosophist, and she visited Seattle. And I remember as a child, it was a big deal because they had her perform at the Moore Theater downtown, and she did her classical Indian dance there. And I remember sitting in the audience, and they put a kind of a chalky powder on the floor, and she would do her dance, and little puffs of powder would go up in the air. And it's quite a precise type of dance. She was instrumental in reviving classical Indian dance there in India, Chennai. I think the center was called Kalakshetra. It was just very close to the Adyar Theosophical Society, and there they taught Indian dance and I think other arts and crafts to keep them alive. I was told a story once that one day she decided that she was going to do this classical dance at a temple there in Adyar, a famous temple, at dawn. And without any advertising, word of mouth spread, and 3,000 people showed up for her performance. She was married to George Arundale, another prominent Theosophist who was many years older than her, but that didn't seem to matter. They had a strong relationship. Another big part of my growing up, you could say, was the liberal Catholic Church. Members of my family were deeply involved in the liberal Catholic Church, and especially my mom. And so much so that she made my father build a liberal Catholic Church chapel in our basement. So I didn't have to go very far to go to church. But what that meant was that when priests and bishops of the liberal Catholic Church came to visit Seattle, they would often stay at our house, and while at our house, they would conduct ceremonies in the basement of our house. It was quite interesting. I remember occasionally it could be quite beautiful. I remember one doing a benediction one night, and it was just, there was no words to describe the energy of that going on. Obviously, I never met Charles Leadbeater. We know someone who did, and we'll talk about her later. But he was also one of the founders of the Liberal Catholic Church, along with Bishop Wedgwood. The idea was that they looked at the Catholic services clairvoyantly, or Leadbeater would, and he would pick out the things that worked really well and notice the things that didn't work very well. And he rewrote the liturgy for the church in a new form for a liberal Catholic Church, which they started. And that is how that started. And there's a book written about that called Science of the Sacraments, which you can find in the bookstore and the library. And anyhow, quite a few early Theosophists were very attracted not only to Leadbeater, but became priests and bishops in the liberal Catholic Church. And my family was no exception. My grandfather was a priest. My uncle was a priest. My father was a deacon. I was an altar boy. Anyhow, and my mom kept things going. And she married a man later who became a bishop. So I'll talk about him later. But some of my very early memories have to do with these people. And in Holland, my mother kept referring to this man, Professor van der Stok, and I evidently I encountered him in the Theosophical Center there in Naarden in Holland. He was quite clairvoyant, and I'm not sure what he was a professor of, but he was involved in the church also. And I guess he made some comments about me when I was 3 years old. I have vague memories of going into a meeting there in Hausen. The town is called Hausen, Huizen. And when I was 3 years old, I spent a couple of months there at the Theosophical Center with my mom. And back in 1957, she said, I saw a fire deva there one day because I pointed up at a tree and I said, look, Mom, look at all that fire. And there was nothing there. So as a child, I could see a little bit, which hasn't been retained, by the way. Another interesting priest that would stay at our house was named Father Francis Camacho de la Vega. I think that's his last name. He came from a noble Spanish family, and he was quite clairvoyant. He lived in Portland, and he would stay with us and tell us stories, and it was quite interesting. He had so many psychic abilities. was quite interesting. One night, he offered to do some of his things, and I had a piece of rock that I had stolen from the Roman Forum. It was very small, but I brought it home, and I gave it to him, and he could psychometrize it, and he pretty much pinpointed where it came from, although he could have been looking at the mental pictures in my aura, but he figured it out quite easily. He was so good that he had been used in a television commercial by Mercedes down in Los Angeles once, where they had him blindfolded. And the thing was, he would say, "This car is so easy to drive, I can do it blindfolded." He was using his clairvoyant vision to steer. So just kind of funny. He was very much interested in Egypt. And he had a ring, I think, that he said belonged to Tutmosis III that he showed us, which was quite interesting. And another thing odd, he came from this Spanish noble family. He ended up living in Cuba, but he said as a child, when he was about 8, I think it was, he sat on the lap of Adolf Hitler, which is kind of odd, but interesting guy. Another clairvoyant involved in the church in Seattle was a woman, I can't remember her name anymore, but she was blind and she would play the organ. And she, very nice soul, she would play the organ during services, but she would also, one of the attractions for her to church work was the fact that she was clairvoyant and could see, the colors and the energies as in different parts of the service. And it was be very much like Leadbeater described, the colors and outpourings, I suppose you could say, that would happen during the service. And so it's interesting to hear these people's perspectives on the hidden side of things. It seems, I think many clairvoyants are attracted to church and religious and spiritual ceremonies. Okay, the next slide is somewhat personal. Remember, this Father Francis was clairvoyant. One thing he did for me was draw a picture of my aura in pastels. Now, this is getting old. The paper in the background used to be quite white. So it changes some of the colors here a little bit, but you can see a central blue color here, quite a bit of yellow, a little bit of orange, and a lot of green around the outside, which I suppose Dora would associate with practicality and so on. But I always hung on to that because how often do you have somebody who can draw your aura? Another important person in my life was Hein van Beuzekum. He was my stepfather since about 1976 when he married my mother, and He was a doctor in Holland, a general practitioner who lived in a small town in the northeast part of Holland. And he was also a priest at that time in the Liberal Catholic Church. And he became the regionary bishop for North and South America when he moved to Ojai. They lived on Orcas for a while, and then Rada Bernier, the international president, asked him to become the head of the esoteric school of Theosophy. And he did that for about 10 years. My mother was deeply involved in that also. And I already mentioned my grandfather and uncles were involved in the church also. And he was, he loved the church work and the ceremonial work, and was deeply influenced by the church. And I would say that, you know, they did services at the church in Ojai. The Liberal Catholic Church has land there on the east end of Ojai, and it's quite nice. And the energies of those services is noticeable. There's a very fine and high energy after service, and a beautiful place for it to happen. The church is not very popular anymore. Things come and go in terms of numbers of people and so on. So I'm not sure what the fate of the church will be in the future, but I know it's been a big part of my family past. Another thing, my Dutch grandfather and grandmother were deeply influenced by Krishnamurti. Yeah, they were, you know, Holland was a big place for Krishnamurti. Before he left the Theosophical Society, they had the Order of the Star there and a center in southern Holland. And so many Dutch people were strongly influenced by Krishnamurti, and it's one of the reasons you see such a Dutch presence in the Theosophical Society. And so my grandfather kept up his interest in Krishnamurti along with my grandmother. And when I was 11, I traveled to Europe with my mother and sister, and we got to spend 3 weeks in Zaan in Switzerland, which is where Krishnamurti would talk. And it was basically next to a river, you know, in the Alps, surrounded by beautiful mountains, very close to a town called Gstaad, which is a famous ski center there in Switzerland, and it's too expensive to stay at anymore. But beautiful, beautiful area, and he loved being there. Yeah, one day we got to visit the house where he would often stay. He was not there at the time, but it was a really old Swiss like log cabin is what I remember. And yeah, hard to describe, but a wooden structure and interesting. There were always a lot of people around him. As a young child, I would listen to him and try to, you know, pay attention, and the terms like constant awareness and listening and observing were key ingredients to his talks, and it did give me some perspective on looking at nature, looking at yourself in your own mind, and the beginnings of meditation, I suppose. for me. One forgotten part of early Theosophy, I don't know, it could have been mostly my mom, but gosh, when I was about, I don't know, I was not very old, maybe 11 or 12, there was a group of people who were very interested in the plight of Tibetan Buddhists and Dharamsala and so on. And they would meet at a house in North Seattle, and my mom would bring me along and my sister, I think, and we'd listen. Not that I really had a clue what there was going on, but I remember one year donating my allowance to, the Tibetan refugees. And later, out of the blue, I got a thank you letter from Lowell Thomas, who, if you're old enough, you would recognize as kind of a famous explorer who had a fascination with Tibet. And I'm afraid I'd lost that letter, but it was kind of cool. Later, Tibetan, a group of about maybe 5 or 6 Tibetan men came to Seattle, and they helped them rent a house very close to the community college there on Broadway. Right behind it, everything's changed since then. But I remember we would walk up there with my mom and go up to the door, and here are all these Tibetan men in their Tibetan clothing and robes and so on. And, I probably looked wide-eyed when I saw them. It's kind of funny now, but they were here to try to learn English. And it was very difficult, as you can imagine. I think one of them was a relative of the Dalai Lama, a close relative, and others were, important Buddhists of the time. And the idea was, learning English, although they could have learned it in India also, I'm sure. But they wanted to learn more about the United States, and Seattle happened to be a test place. I don't think it went very easily for them because just such a culture change. And it was just 1959 that they had to leave Tibet. And anyhow, interesting memory from my childhood. Now we're getting into more familiar territory for many of you. Dora and Fritz Kunz and their family were important members of the Seattle Theosophical Society. Dora became a national president of the Theosophical Society. She was quite clairvoyant and wrote these books down here, which many of you have read. And we've all had many encounters. Most of us have had many encounters with the family. And I helped John and Ino move from New York to Seattle back in 1978 and pack up their house and Dora's house too, because she lived there, but she was, I think, at Wheaton at the time. And that was a big deal for them. So it made me a kind of an unofficial member of the family for a while. And John and I know John was Dora's son, and one of the main things they did in life was make possible many of Dora's ideas and plans. They were the practical side of getting things done, and had quite an interesting time doing it. Dora lived in Seattle for the last part of her life. She also founded, she and her husband and a couple others founded Camp Indralaya on Orcas Island, which was a big part of my life also. And she would notice the Deva life of the camp and the island. There's quite a large Deva on Mount Constitution that is what some would call a landscape Deva, and presided over the San Juan archipelago. And she would make contact with that Deva, and eventually there was a Deva associated with the camp itself. The camp is a vegetarian camp, and ideas of harmlessness and working with nature are very important to the people at the camp, and it stays so to this day. And the camp was the meeting ground for many great discussions on Theosophy over the years, as you know. Her husband, Fritz, had been secretary to Charles Leadbeater. Some years ago, I managed to see one of his notebooks, and of kind of a diary of his parts of his travels with Leadbeater. It was quite interesting. Nicholas Van Gelder used it with Kirsten in the book that was written about Dora, Most Unusual Life. Fritz also published a magazine, Main Currents in Modern Thought. And while packing up their house for them, I found a letter by the physicist Heisenberg to Fritz saying that he was very interested in the work he was doing and so on. It was pretty cool. There's no uncertainty about that. Anyhow, you know who you are. Thank you all. And, you know, theosophical work is group work. There's no getting around that. And I'll talk about that more later. But nothing like this can happen without the aid of other people. So thank you. And here's a picture from Camp Indralaya of the great Madrona tree. Looking out, the mountain over on the left that you only see part of is Mount Constitution. And this Madrona tree must have a special Deva associated with it, and gets a lot of attention from people at camp, as you know. One other important Theosophist was Harry Van Gelder. He was Dora's brother. And he was also a very clairvoyant individual, spent a lot of time around him. He would come to Camp Indralaya every summer in the 70s after he got back from Australia. He was also a chiropractor and lived in Ojai. And his discussions, I think, were really important to a lot of Theosophists, partly because he had that clairvoyant perception and gave us, you know, a lot of information. He also would do these incredible group meditations. He would have us get in a big circle, you know, like 70 people or whatever, and chant Om Agni, Om Surya, and over and over again, and creating this incredible energy. I think he did it partly to attract certain devas, and it probably worked. May have even attracted a master at one time. But he gave a kind of a practical outlook on Theosophy that was quite important to a lot of people. And the people he taught how to use this information more specifically for healing. He was very interested in healing, and a lot of his life work had to do with healing. Another interesting person I had the good fortune of meeting, there was a pianist who came to the Seattle TS named Joel Salzman, who is one of the finest classical pianists I've ever heard. And he had studied in Paris and with a teacher who was in the lineage of Beethoven. So he was just excellent. And he would talk to me, and he had a strong influence. And through him, I met James Kelleher. And one summer, I think it was 1980, we all went. We heard about this mysterious Indian Vedic astrologer named M.K. Ghandi. And he would fly into a city and have 20 or 25 people lined up to do horoscopes for, and we'd all meet him at a hotel down near the airport, and he would talk to us, all 20 some people in one evening, and then he would fly out the next day. Well, anyhow, this is how James met his teacher, whom James claimed he was really an adept. And let's see if I have the next slide. Yeah, well, anyhow, yeah. So this is where James got his beginning in astrology. And obviously M.K. Ghandi saw something in James in being able to be a great astrologer, and that actually happened. James has written books on astrology. He's on the faculties of Vedic astrology institutions. He talked many times at the Seattle Lodge, and his most famous talk he does every year called World Predictions, which I talked to you about a few weeks ago. And he has a tremendous memory, and he has been able to study the charts of countries and politicians, and he's done horoscopes for political leaders in India. He's traveled all over India. He's led tours of holy places in India, and made a life out of it. So it was quite interesting. James and I even did a program together on astrology up at Camp Indralaya one summer, and which was quite nice. So James is now so popular that it is hard to get a hold of him, but he's still writing and has a website where you can find more information. He lives in California. And his teacher, M.K. Ghandi, had a place in London and in Bombay. This is just a picture of the book that James wrote that is really quite an amazing book on Vedic astrology. But his teacher was a very mysterious guy, and he told me once to bring books to him, and he would look at them and say, you know, whether they were good or bad, or, you know, which ones. And I did that, and he said, oh yeah, I know this author, this is good, and so on and so forth. And once I had a lucid dream with Mr. Ghandi, and in the dream I went to a motel, and I could see the room number on the motel room, and then I met with him, and in this lucid dream, and went over a stack of astrology books and talked about that for a while. And I thought it was so interesting that I called James Kelleher and told him about it. And I said, it was room number such and such. And James said, yeah, that adds up to 8. Mr. Ghandi would only stay in rooms that had the number 8 when you added up the numbers. He was into numerology also. So that was interesting. One interesting thing in my life is that I've met a fair number of what are considered gurus and Indian teachers. And it's interesting that I have to say that it did not take a lot of effort on my part to do this. It always happened very naturally. And it's going back over it, you know, Mr. Ghandi, I guess, would be included in that group. But the first one that, besides the Theosophical teachers like Sri Ram, the ones outside the Theosophical Society, first one would have been Swami Satchidananda, who did the opening prayer at the Woodstock Music Festival in 1969. And here's a picture of that on the bottom left, with a vast sea of humanity and Satchidananda surrounded by disciples. That made him very popular in the United States, as you can imagine. And they built a center called Yogaville in Virginia. And here's a picture of him with MGM Lion, I think it is. It's kind of interesting, but this center in Virginia is shaped like a lotus flower. And years later, as many of you know, I had a small business, a crafts business, where our main product was a windsock that looked like a lotus flower. And somehow or another, the people at Yogaville found out about us and would order those windsocks from us and sell them there at their center. And they were very nice. But within a month of being at Woodstock, Swami Satchidananda came to Camp Indralaya, which is kind of odd. And my recollection was that it was like early September. And, you know, I was kind of part of the resident staff there at the time. I would have only been 15, but who cares? And all of a sudden, all these people, all these followers of Swami Satchidananda swarmed in, and for 2 or 3 days at least. And they would be doing yoga out in the meadow and having meetings in the kitchen if the weather wasn't all that great. And I remember being asked to give him some fruit, and meeting him that way. He is known for integral yoga, and quite a Capricorn, if that means anything to you. He reminded me of someone who would be involved in higher initiations. He seemed like the real deal. So that was an early encounter with an interesting guru at camp, and it took no effort for me to get to meet him. Another one was Swami Muktananda, who was quite well known in the United States. He is known for Siddha Yoga. His group was quite large in Seattle. They had a large meeting hall across from Roosevelt High School. And they would have these intensive meditations where you would stay for hours and hours. And let's see, what do they call it? Well, it's Siddha Yoga, but I think they called it Shaktipad. He was interested in the energies of Kundalini and its awakening in people. And the old friend I mentioned, Joel Salzman, the pianist, was quite involved with Swami Muktananda. So when Joel found out that my wife and I were going to drive to California in, I think it was February of 1980, Joel said, you have to stop and see Swami Muktananda. He will be at the pier in Santa Monica, which many of you would know about. And so we said, okay, we'll go. And we went down there and parked our little Honda across the street and walked over there, and no problems getting in or anything like that. We got a couple of peacock feathers for darshan to give him, and went in there. It was a large group, Indian get together where they have a large chair, devoted to the teacher, and an altar, and so on. And went in there, and there were a lot of Hollywood types in there. I remember the actress Jill Clayburgh was in there, and everybody was in a good mood. And it was our turn to go up and have darshan with him, and gave him a peacock feather, which he swished around. And I remember he would look intensely at you, and even though there were hundreds of people in the place, when it was your turn, he was focused on you, and he had a lovely smile on his face. He died a couple of years later, and his books, I think, are important books. Another interesting guru that we got to meet was Sant Thakar Singh. He was a Sikh religious leader and succeeded Kirpal Singh. Again, I did not do anything out of the ordinary to try to meet him. My wife was actually interested in him along with her mother. And he and his followers actually started an ashram in Southern Oregon near Sutherland, I think, Sutherland, just along the a river there, quite remote actually, and beautiful place. We went there a couple of times. And they decided, or the group members decided, they wanted to have him do a talk in Seattle. And they knew we lived there in the University District in a rental house, and asked us if he could stay at our house. And again, we said sure, and we turned a bedroom into his room, and where he stayed 2 or 3 days. And it was quite the scene, because 70 people would suddenly show up for meditation at 6 o'clock in the morning. And, it was kind of a shock to my system, because the house wasn't that big. And that means people were sitting everywhere, on the stairs, in the basement, all over the living room floor, kitchen, you name it. Every spot was taken, and it was quite interesting. I did get to talk to him a little bit. He knew things about you without being told. He knew I was involved in astrology, and he asked for people to look at the inner light in meditation. And meditation was a very important part of his practice and what he taught. He would have people meditate for long periods of time also. And seemed like a very good guy. Many of you know this story already. I haven't met Satya Sai Baba in person. Many of you know about him as being an important spiritual teacher, even avatar of the 20th century. And I first learned about him, I think it was about 1970, and he, friends who were involved in the Theosophical Society talked about him and his miraculous powers and so on. And Harry Van Gelder, who I mentioned earlier, talked about him and said that he thought Sai Baba had a perfected mental body or ability, and that was one of the things that allowed him to manifest things physically, make things appear. As many of you know, Sai Baba could materialize things out of nowhere, and one of the main things that he materialized was sacred ash, or vibhuti, as it was described. And followers all over the world would describe this sacred ash appearing on pictures of him or altars of him in their homes or centers. He's still quite revered by many people. And so my curiosity was definitely provoked. And there was a member of the Seattle Theosophical Society named Frida Quenneville. Some of you might remember. And she became a devotee of Sai Baba and would save up her money and go to India to see him whenever she could. But she led a Sai Baba group up on 19th and Republican at her apartment. And that is, I got involved with that for a while in 1980. And so I think that created a kind of a link with Sai Baba through singing bhajans and devotional songs and so on. Many meditations and seeing movies and reading books about him. It just kind of made him a bigger thing in your mind. He created with his followers, basically a huge hospital and city pretty much in India, and did many miraculous things. And so one night I had a vivid dream experience with him. And it was about 3:30 in the morning. And I remember seeing this, looking down at this mountain and seeing people moving around below. And then I was transported to what felt like India, to his ashram. And it was quite sunny, and I was in a room with quite a bunch of other people, and it had large windows. And in this dream, he was in the room, and he came over to me and basically touched me on the head up here, and kind of blessing. And that was the end of the dream. But it's the timing of this dream that is so interesting, because 5 hours later, literally 5 hours later, this happened. Not this. This is where part of his structures and buildings in India. But this is what happened 5 hours later, which I thought was pretty amazing. And maybe he was telling me something, or I'm not sure what, but you're not going to forget a dream or experience when something like that happens. So that was my Sai Baba experience, along with more that you might know about, some of you. But Chuck, who is in the audience, gave many talks at the Seattle Theosophical Society, and he had stated that he had studied Alice Bailey books, the teachings of the Master Joel Kuhl, and so on, and was a professor of psychology in Seattle. And he kept referring to his teacher. And after a while, I caught on that I should maybe listen to this and pay attention. And when his teacher is named Parvati Kumar, we referred to him as KPK. And I quite enjoy talking with Chuck. And when I found out that KPK was going to be doing an intensive group meeting in San Jose, I said, wow, I should not ignore this. I should go. And it was, I think it was in, January or February of 2018. It doesn't really matter, but it was in San Jose at Motilal Hotel there. And quite a few people from the San Jose area came. There's many Indian people in San Jose involved in the tech industry. And they all showed up, and we had large group meetings there. And thanks to my association with Chuck, I was able to have a personal interview with who we call Master KPK. And he's the most gracious individual. I've quite nervous coming up to the meeting, thinking, wow, what am I getting into here? But he was so gracious. And once you start talking to him, it's like you've known him forever. And we talked a bit, and Chuck mentioned that I had that dream or experience with Sai Baba, and then KPK told us about his experience with Sai Baba, also how Sai Baba picked him out from in a large crowd and said, you know, I would like you to come up to my room to talk. And KPK said, can I bring my wife? You know, she wasn't with him right at the moment, but he managed to find her, and they went up to Sai Baba's personal room and spent an hour talking. And, you know, Sai Baba had said that to KPK that he was quite impressed by his techniques for teaching people, and you know, the results that it was producing. Sai Baba had some, you know, didn't always feel good about the fact that people came to him often to see phenomena, let's say, and KPK had quite practical techniques for teaching, which Sai Baba thought was a good thing. And at the end, Sai Baba said, here, I want to give you something. And he materialized this diamond ring. And then all of a sudden, I'm sitting there listening intently, and this diamond ring is thrust right in front of my face, and I didn't realize that, you know, I realized quickly that this is the one that he was talking about, and he wears it all the time. So that was quite special. And he's holding a hat that says Master CVV, which was the earliest teacher in his lineage, and who had quite special abilities. And we still meditate with him in mind and invoke his energy. CVV is associated with the energy of Master Jupiter and Master Agastya in South India in the Nilgiri Hills, as is described in Theosophical literature. KPK spoke highly of HBB and refers to her often in his talks. And he said that her teachings would be in effect for 432 years, which is quite interesting. You can see some of the Theosophical masters in the background. In a book called The Aquarian Master, it refers to KPK. The violet flame is something associated with his type of energy and Aquarian energy and the seventh ray. He works with groups of people around the world. He resides in India and has traveled to Europe and the United States and South America something like 24 times to do these group intensives and meetings and initiations. And he is a very practical person. He's what we would call a certified public accountant, and began a large company which in South India, and his teachers believe in getting married and having children and being normal. Normality is a good thing for a spiritual person. And I like that practical approach. His teacher is this other picture down here was Master E.K., long Indian name, Arikala. Anyhow, Chuck would know. But a very beautiful soul who was quite the teacher. Also taught astrology, and which is one of the great appeals of their teaching is they like Theosophy, they like astrology, they like the teachings of the master DK. All the things that I appreciate are embodied in their teachings. So how could I say no to seeing Master KPK when he came to San Jose? And very impressive. And then he had mentioned in the book, The Aquarian Master, that the Aquarian Age began with the coronation of Queen Victoria in 1838, that she had been the first to see the futility of world domination, as shown by the British in their conquering so many countries around the world. He also mentioned that from 1900 to 1910, our planet went through a planetary initiation. Halley's Comet was involved in that in a way. Remember, in Theosophy, all matter has life. And it's interesting here that a comet, which also has life, can also bring with it a teaching and energy from outside our solar system. And Master CVV was able to channel and realize some of that energy and use it to help foster changes on our planet. It should be known that Aquarian energy is the energy of synthesis and uses the energy of the seventh ray, things like air travel, lighter foods, and vegetarianism, and the rapid developments in electronic and worldwide group dynamics are Aquarian, as well as what we call social media. The Aquarian age is the age of group work. And the sooner people realize that, the better. Working in groups brings safety. You can't get overstimulated. That way the energy is more balanced. And but it's also a time, the changes are just so rapid. Aquarius is an air sign, it's lighter. And it makes possible the movement of electronic waves through the air, let's say. And so we probably haven't seen anything yet. The original member of this group of teachers was who they call Master CVV. He had been a lifelong member of the Theosophical Society long before we were, and loved the teachings of HBV, and by all accounts had miraculous powers of healing and transformation, and was well known in his village and town for the things that he could do that were pretty much awe-inspiring. And he is still invoked today. Boy, it's been almost 2 years now Chuck, but we went down to Mount Shasta and Master KPK went there, and along with about 400 and something people. It was quite a group. They had 5 tour buses to ferry people around to different places. And we stayed in a town on the south side called McLeod, which was quite nice. And it had facilities that we could use, and a large hall that was where the talks and meditations would occur. And we'd eat meals across the street. And then we made trips up to the side of Mount Shasta. We could only get so far up there in May because of the snowpack. But one day, myself and a couple of others left the group and hiked up through the snow to the Panther Creek meadows, which is where supposedly a large ashram on etheric levels is located, and did a little meditation there, and tried to pick up on the energies of the place, and it was quite nice. And then we hiked back down, and in the process got quite sunburned. Snow has that effect, and it was quite sunny that day, but being on the side of Mount Shasta was fantastic. And I've been told by Chuck and he by Master KPK that Mount Shasta is kind of like an outpost of Shambhala in the West. And so it's a center of great energy, and also an energy of center of the 7th ray, and that it's used by the Master Comte de Saint-Germain in the West as an important energy center. This is sort of like the male energy, and Mount Rainier would be somewhat similar, but more the female energy. Earlier on, Mark Sanders mentioned that an interest in UFOs, and Master KPK said, you know, UFOs are attracted to places like this because they pick up on the energies. And I think there have been quite a few sightings. There's quite a few different groups that have been going to Mount Shasta for years. It's not that terrible of a drive from Seattle. I think it takes 8 or 9 hours. And if traffic's not terrible, which it can be, but it's well worth spending time there. And if you get a chance to go in late summer, the snowpack will be less, and you can go further up the mountain from Shasta City. It's quite worthwhile.